I thought I'd begin with really this kind of set of ideas. So I think that the role of the early childhood educator is really complex. And I've just finished an editorial for a research education bulletin. I hope you may all be interested in reading it, from the Scottish Educational Research Association Early Years Network. There are 14 articles. It begins with practitioner development and early childhood practice, and the standard for early childhood practice, and the final article is love-led practice. But in the editorial, I've written about the status of people working with the youngest children. And I think that in there lies a set of issues for anybody working in the early years, whether it's in before school, at school, in further education college, in university. There is something about, if you work with the youngest children, what's your status? For me, it's the most important phase of life. But I think as you go up the hierarchy of education, and it is very hierarchical, then you get a sense in which the older the child, the more important the person is who's working with them. So, in higher education in the ivory towers, people are incredibly important. These professors and these people who write research articles and these people who think they have a huge knowledge, they must stay in touch with practice. And I think I went into higher education after 23 years of teaching because I thought there wasn't enough about practice. And then I was challenged to make that work too. I think actually there are many ways of people doing that effectively, but hang on to that notion of hierarchy, because I think it's one of the issues about agency of professionals in early childhood. And what do we actually mean by agency? Well, in its very simplest, I think it's the power to act. It's the power to do something that you feel is important, to feel the confidence, to feel you've got the ability to justify, to articulate what it is that you believe is important. But I think it's dependent on a number of factors, and Mark Priestley's work will tell you this, that it's dependent on both what you bring to the situation, but on the conditions and the means of which you can act. So leadership is really important for the average teacher's capacity to act. If you're in a very prescribed situation, you can do much less than if you have enabling leadership that supports you and your personal development as part of a collaborative process. And not only enabling, but there are other terms like distributed or empowering, but who holds the power if there's empowerment? Is that a power that individually we feel, or is the power something that's handed out to us by those who are in charge, if you like? So I think we have to tease out, and you will find your own ideas about agency, I think. But let me say something about, you'll realize already I don't read in a linear way from the slides. So I'm going to hop to another bullet point. So if we think about identity, what's your identity as a practitioner? What kind of a teacher, what kind of an early childhood educator do you want to be, or are you? Did anybody ever ask you that when you were in your initial education? I'm not sure that it happens very often, but I do remember often with BEd students at the end of their third year, and with our BA childhood practice students at about the same time in their degree, saying, okay, you've got this far. What do you believe in? What are your passions? What would you put your hand on heart and say, I'm not going to give up on this. And for the young teachers, BA childhood practice people are different. They come in with experience, but they can cast their minds way back to when they were very young and inexperienced as well. Would you be able to, and as you look back, do you think you were able to hold on to those beliefs that you had as you came out fresh from your initial teacher or childhood practice education? What were the circumstances that helped you to hang on to that dream and that identity of the kind of practitioner you thought you would be? What were your values? And if you're not sure if you were able to do that, are you able to do it now? And if you were able to, are you still able to? So it's really worth thinking about and taking stock about, you know, how your values may have moved and changed, how continuing learning helps that, where the confidence comes from, and what the context does to that. And I think that leads to the idea that there might be a number of different attributes that help you think about it. So I find ecological thinking is really powerful, and I'm going to show you, I'm very visual, and I'm going to show you some diagrams that help me with that. But I think when you think ecologically, you need to think about your own dispositions as a practitioner. You need to think about the resources that you have to draw on and what Bronfenbrenner calls force characteristics. What have you got as a force for change, as a force for influence, as a force for simply doing a good job in the playroom or the classroom? So is agency a good thing? I think it's absolutely essential. Absolutely and completely essential, but it's tied up with belief in yourself professionally, with what you think your professional identity is, and indeed your personal identity. And I hope that the idea of thinking ecologically will be helpful, and we'll talk about shared words, shared meanings, and what that means for shared practices. And agency can be a collaborative matter as well. I'm going to hop to the other side of this slide for a minute, and then I'm going to come back to the quote I've put there. So these ideas of complexity of role come from the report that we did called Sustaining the Ambition, and it amuses me now to think of the title. We thought it was a really clever one, following Building the Ambition in 2014. And we were saying, well, okay, what do you need to do to sustain that? And the context was falling numbers, was nursery school closures, falling numbers of GTCS registered teachers in the early childhood workforce, and I advocate for a mixed workforce. I think teachers have their place, just as I think early childhood practitioners have a hugely important role. It's not an either or for me, it's a both, and how they might play together. But just now, I'm talking about what we discovered about the complexity of the teacher role, that it requires a really sound depth and knowledge of the curriculum, that their understanding is about pedagogy, and currently we're almost overwhelmed with the notion of play pedagogy, but the understanding of how you enact your approaches with children with your curriculum knowledge. And that brings this sophisticated idea of progressing learning, not progress through curriculum, but progressing children's learning in deep and meaningful ways that recognize what they bring to the task. In there, we tucked additional support needs in, supporting transitions, the importance of family and community engagement, and as I've already mentioned, notions of leadership. So these are broad headings, but the publication we produced, I think, is worth a read for anybody in early childhood. It came from these concerns, as I said, about closures. Now, if you hop back to my second last bullet point on the left-hand column, I think it should be the left as you see it too, Eisner, who was all about children's and adults' creativity. He had an arts background. He, in talking about how we can create change and movement and focus in education, said this: if a bird has been in a cage for a decade and suddenly finds the door open, it should not be surprising if the bird does not wish to leave. I think that's a really interesting and good thing to hang on to. The first round of curriculum development in this country was the 5 to 14 curriculum. That, after primary memorandum and the texts we followed before that weren't curriculum in the same sense, but they were certainly guidance. That decade plus 4 years of 5 to 14 started as visionary and became technical. And I think when Jack McConnell launched Curriculum for Excellence in 2004, as an educator, his dream was giving professionalism back to the professionals in education. But if you've been tied into something prescriptive, and it was more prescriptive in some areas than others, but I know local authorities where I had students who weren't allowed to follow the children's interests because it wasn't the topic for that particular year of the primary school. Well, how do you motivate children if you're dumping something on them that they have very little interest in? We have to be very clever to create that interest. So what Mark Priestley says, and it's thanks to him that I came across the Eisner quotation as well, he talks about an edifice of control and performativity. And I want to look at what that edifice looks like for us just now. So I'm just also checking time as I go. I hope I'm all right just now. So this first one I've talked about. Of course, we're in a situation in early learning and childcare, but my goodness, that has impact for schools, of an expansion. Now, we know it was paused because of COVID. We know the high hopes of Marie Todd to get this into action again, and we know a number, if not many, local authorities are already embarked on the 1140 hours because they were planning for it to happen. But we've had that interruption of COVID and the whole question of starting up again and going back, if you like. And for me, I expect for you too, not wanting to go back to, I actually hate the phrase new normal now because I've heard it so often, but not wanting to go back to how it was. I have a feeling it's time, and I think I said this to Anne and Pauline the other day, I think it's time for a new national conversation about education. We need to know what it is we want to do now, and that comes back to your agency and identity. I commend to you the Early Childhood Transitions Position Statement. You can get that on the on Education Scotland website in a short form and a long form, and lots of materials to go with it. It's a set of principles that I think are really helpful, but it also embraces the idea of why do we talk early learning and childcare and primary? Why don't we talk about a continuum, which I want to come to and which I think is becoming really clear for us how we might do that in the new national practice guidance. So we've gone from building the ambition to sustain the ambition to realizing the ambition. And I actually think we might be back to sustaining the ambition. Whether we want to do a second edition or not, I don't know. But it might be something that might come from the leadership research I'm doing at the moment. And then, of course, I put the United Nations Rights of the Child document as it is now. But you'll all know that that will be enshrined into Scottish law next year. And that's very powerful for us with our GERFEC approaches, with putting children at the centre and with what we want to do next. I'm not going to spend a long time on this. I think there's a plan at some point, isn't there, to draw Anne from the fourth of these documents, the 2021. But And of course, this is only one aspect of what you might look at internationally. They're quite comprehensive, and I recommend them because they draw from many nations. They're not just from Brussels, but they are from Brussels. And from left to right, Starting Strong was an excellent piece of work that looked at the transitions continuum. Marion Burns was one of the readers for it, and make sure that Scotland's in there, which is brilliant. And an elaboration from that comes in the 2019 documentation there, with a further Starting Strong survey. But we go from Starting Strong to Engaging Young Children, look at the discourse of those titles, to providing quality early childhood education and care, to looking at early learning and well-being. Starting Strong, Engaging Young Children and Providing Quality, are real practice documents with a background in why. They will help you articulate. Early learning and well-being is rather different. It's about what I call baby PISA. It's about assessment, fundamentally, but it's been wrapped around in well-being and learning. It started out as a study to look at assessment. And we know what a mixed view there is on early testing and assessment of children in our country. So read that study with great care and understand the background that 16 nations stepped up to take part in that study until their early childhood workforces and academics said, no, this is not appropriate for young children. So we were left with the United States of America, with England, and with Estonia. New Zealand pulled out, Germany pulled out, and the list goes on. So there are some really interesting things in it, but I suppose what I'm saying is bring your critique to your reading. We don't have to accept everything that's in these documents. And if you think of what Mark said about, I'll just go back just for a second, an edifice of performativity, we need to know the context and we need to know the helps and constraints that exist for us. So I'm going to try and go quickly through these, and these are the photos you won't get with the final presentation, but I think for our agency, we really need to understand children's agency. If we're going to be effective educators, I think respect is a huge word. Look at the power of this little fella as he plays picnic in the Australian bush, I have to tell you, feeding his daddy a grape. But how that takes him to play with his teddies and dollies in the house and to make a picnic on the floor. So the third picture was before the picnic. The fourth picture was afterwards. Look at how the child takes from the experience, because the parents transported an old plastic tea set which actually belonged to his mummy 35 years before, and how it's used in the play. Look how children get into books. No, not all children have that opportunity, and you might say this is very privileged. But early childhood should be a gift of time. So this little person in these three photos is in what she called her holiday house. She's barely 2. And she is absolutely and utterly into books. But she's also a wild child who climbs and hides behind trees and enjoys the great outdoors. She will recount the story of the stick man as you pick up sticks in the park. Today she found a wonderful stick and stood astride it, and I've given away, she's my granddaughter, stood astride it and said, zoom to the moon. And she was the witch with a broom. So don't underestimate what stories do for children's vocabulary, for their learning. She has all the competence of a beginning reader. She knows which way up the book goes. She knows that words communicate something. You can see where she's found a little tucky place in the bathroom. She's reading Zoom on a broom, broom on a zoom, whatever. This is Maisie Start's nursery. 2 weeks later, she started nursery. I can't quite see what this one is, but I think it might be one of her favourite books about the owl. And look at this fella. Real chip off the old block there, I think, sitting on the toilet reading. He's 6. He's a young fluent reader who had an absolute block about writing. So how does that happen? Look at him when he's very young and first comes across blocks. Look at the funds of knowledge and the working theories that this child builds up over time. And this is what we absolutely have to hang on to in our play pedagogy and in our identity as early childhood teachers. The competence, creativity, funds of knowledge and working theories that children have. And they do have them, whatever the context. So this child, as I said, lives in Australia. Here's his first set of blocks. This is what he did with them as he took them out of the parcel. He already categorized by shape. Look how he lines them up. You can say lots of things about schema in that. Look at him here solving a STEM project, or in the case of his school, a STEAM project, where he's to design a building. And look at what he's using. He's looking, these are toilet rolls. He's got his animals from when he was little. He's got books to stack up. He's got the blocks. He's making use of a whole lot of resources. And here is his building. And then this is how he draws it out. His parents were desperate because he wouldn't write at school. The work he was getting home during lockdown was this kind of thing, to get your writing firmly within the blocks and to have model handwriting. This is one of the best bits of writing he did because it was real. But before that, he would have a hissy fit about trying to write at all. So what we talked about was language and context. And he and his mother and my colleague Jenny Carey and I are currently working on an article about unlocking writing during lockdown. And to go on again with agency at home, but this is after school. Working theories might lead you to come home from school, for example, and say, well, I want to make a balance scale, but I don't have any things that I have at school, so I'm going to see what I've got. I've got some blue tack, I've got some paper clips, and I've got 2 elastic bands. Can I make a balance scale by weighing things in each of the elastic bands and see if one is heavier than the other? Well, elastic bands don't actually weigh me or a pencil case or daddy or granny's bed or any of the other things you might write on a list. So they turned to what you can actually do with great weight. And you can see the joy on these children's faces as their mother lifts a kitchen stool above her head. I hardly dare tell you what happened next. They were all lifting. Can we do that in school? We certainly can talk about weight in real ways. I've shown you a set of photos that the kind of are middle class and privileged in a way. But this happens on the streets in Glasgow near me. Sunny summer day, they do exist. We didn't have them outside this summer for children, but this was a couple of years ago. An old wardrobe, an old bed head as well, actually, an ironing board, a bottle of juice, and 4 children out playing of varied ages. What I took joy in, and why I asked them and their mums who were hanging out along the fence if I could take a photo and what I would use it for, what gave me joy was, do you know what? Middle of a blazing summer day and they were playing school. That wasn't the bit that gave me joy. The joy was to see the older child sharing a book with the younger children out in the street, having a piece of paper there with some print on it, having pencils, but improvising with an old wardrobe and enjoying the sunshine, while mum at home does the ironing and hangs the t-shirt over the railings. And that was what was going on. So let's not prescribe by children's contexts. Every child brings experiences to school. And this is where I want to take you, I hope, a quick journey into thinking ecologically. Very happy to share these and some of the papers that go with them. But this is my attempt at visualizing Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. So I think, and this goes all through the way through education, the drawing is to suggest connectivity and being relational. But participation and agency and collaboration seem to me at the root of parental agency, child agency, and teacher agency. And here are some of the influences which I'm going to show you. I'm going to unpick this a little bit. So if we look at the middle layers, we've got children and people there in the middle. We've got these attributes I talked about, dispositions, what Bronfenbrenner calls demand characteristics. They're kind of what you see and what your intuition is the first time you meet somebody. But be wary of them, because they can make us think about it. They can make us stereotype. We have to be very careful. And what about these attributes you can bring as your resources? That's your capital, your human capital. So we could bring a social capital lens to it. But what happens in life, in our education systems, is that the interaction between people, things, and representations. And they might be better words, things and representations, than the formal language. Layer that up on top of home, early childhood and primary, and where they intersect, and see how that begins to influence. And traditionally, the Bronfenbrenner model is these ever-increasing circles. But I want to say to you, they're not like nested dolls, which he used as an analogy. They're not one inside the other. They're permeating and interactive, and it's that interactive notion that I've tried to capture here. These are all networks of things that are going on that influence what's going on in here. And if we take an even wider view, we can see government policy, rights and responsibilities, our social institutions, equity, diversity, and social justice. And all the time, they influence the agency we have, our capacity to collaborate, and our participation in the life of work, early childhood, school, and beyond. It's a very quick tour, but I've written about it and I'd be happy to share. So going on to shared words, shared meanings, and shared practices, we are, have I 5 minutes left? Yeah, thanks. I hope everybody's okay. I'm just cracking on here, and I hope that you're finding it interesting and following. But I wanted to show this little model, something I did a while ago, and I think I've rejigged it. I want to think about learning and development. And traditionally, we say everybody in early childhood needs to know lots about child development. If they don't, they're into a non-starter. But child development, as in ages and stages, is one thing. And child development in a social context is another. So I would put the child development ages and stages and milestones in this within the child development. How the child moves from being a crawler to a walker to a runner. How the child moves from thick story, card-covered storybooks for toddlers through to coping with real pages and not ripping them and so on, and understanding text. Here, we've got systems-related, contextualized influences, and that's my ecology. That's all the things that are trafficking in and out all of the time that influence the child's experience, often indirectly. And the ideal for me is when we bring these two together, the interpersonal and the socio-cultural. We cannot do our education on the basis of milestones. They're not linear in children. They move up and down, they move sideways. But if we bring the lens of social cultural experiences, learning at the elbow of the adults, thinking about children's funds of knowledge and their working theories, then I think we can unpick this similar language. We talk the same language, you know, wherever we are in education, but we don't mean the same things. And that's where our agency as a combined workforce will develop if we can share our intentions and motivations for children. Then we might avoid the major discontinuities that we have within our settings, between settings, around relationships, around pedagogy and curriculum. It's a challenge, and it's a challenge for parents and children as well. I'll share these. These are 5 to 14 days. They go way back to the beginning of my study. One teacher's view, two the philosophies, the views on practice and teaching style, effects of curriculum innovation and play as a medium for learning, way back before 2000. And two teachers, not their real names, Mrs. Drummond's the nursery teacher, Mrs. Devine's the primary one teacher, and they worked so closely together. But you can see how they typify themselves. Kind of pressure on teachers makes it harder to respond to your instinct, says Mrs. Devine about curriculum innovation. Mrs. Drummond says, I'm getting used to the framework. All my work builds on it, but it doesn't bind me, was her view. Observation and awareness, feeling strongly about the environmental context. Baking, art, computer, storytelling, construction, jigsaws, water and sand, house area, all in primary one. Play pedagogy isn't new, it's how we share and articulate it that is. And then there are comments about the child before, and preschool's not a word I use now, in the nursery time, and how she flourishes when she goes on into school. She's one of my case study young women now, but child at the time. And this is my attempt. It's terribly complex, and forgive me for it, but it's about children's trajectories through education. So this child goes on an upward trajectory. She attended 2 different nurseries, and she felt better about only going to one primary one. That worked better for her. But when she went on into secondary, her well-being dropped. This is well-being. It rises. Then it dropped. And then as she went into senior school, she gets another drop. With her attainment in literacy and numeracy, that really had a little bump upwards, and then it settled by the end of the primary 1 year. Then between primary 2 and primary 7 and senior 1, it dropped. And again, it's patchy. What's the red line? The red line is the average of her peer group. So she's under the line a lot of the time. She only peaks at the end of primary 1. Her well-being and attainment diverge. Mainly, she gets a downward trajectory as she goes through school. And she disappeared from my study at the end of senior 4. I thought she dipped out of school altogether. She wrote to me in senior 6 and said, I had to get out. I was being badly bullied. My whole sense of agency and self-worth had plummeted. I couldn't do a thing. I didn't do well in my her authority to introduce the national fours. I didn't do well in them. She went to another school in a neighbouring authority, and there she flourished. She made friends, she recovered her spirit, and she was talking of going to college or university. How dominant are these early years for people? If you go downwards in primary, do you manage to recover? My whole longitudinal study has been about this, and it tells me that what we do in early childhood is hugely significant for the whole of our lives. But there is such a thing as a good transition. It's just, and I can tell you the ingredients of it, but not every child experiences it, and every child should. Look at this joyful drawing. The same child was asked to draw herself in a play park in primary 1. And the picture was very different. It was much more preset. So I don't think we want to ask children to draw specific things. We want to enable them to draw and talk to us about it. And for me, talk, relationships, dispositions, respect are at the heart of our professional identity and our agency and our voice. And I do believe in the present context, we have a renewed opportunity to exercise those concepts.